actual HTML element on the page that you want to render it into. So in our case, we would just say document.getElementById, quotes, and we gave it an ID of app. And as soon as you type that in, cool, down in the preview area, we see our JSX, right? Hello, the sky is blue. Only this simple H1 and paragraph is not what we actually want to build. This time we want to use React to build it. Now, in order to save a ton of typing, because typing in basic HTML is not educational, whether you watched the last video or not, I want you to visit this separate CodePen. This is a finished product CodePen, and you can find a link to this in the description of this video. Okay, but once you do visit this link, we can just borrow or copy and paste the code from this column. Right, so I just want you to select everything in the HTML area. So you can press Control A on Windows or Command A on Mac, just copy everything over. And then over in our React code, let's keep the overall React fragment, but let's get rid of the H1 and the P. So just like this, and then just paste in our clipboard. Okay, now right away, this is not going to work. So we don't see any content output down here. And that's because in JSX, we can't just say class equals because the word class is a reserved word in JavaScript. Instead, within JSX, we want this to be class name, uppercase N. Now we don't want to have to fix that manually, so let's just do a global find and replace. So in CodePen, on Windows, you can press Control-Shift-F. On Mac, you can press Command-Option-F. So here it asks us, what do we want to replace? Let's just say class. Push Enter. What do you want to replace it with? Say class, uppercase name. Push Enter. Let's click this All button. Cool. Now, because I already fixed this one, you can see it reads class name name. We don't want that, so you can just fix that. But now they should all read class name equals. Okay, but even with that change in place, we still see that nothing's being output. So we still have a few more errors to fix here. First of all, let's pay attention to our input field element here. So this is valid HTML5 code. However, in JSX, if you have a self-closing element that doesn't have a matching closing tag, you do want to include the /, oops, Let me adjust that so it fits on a single line. You do need to include this / here in order for it to work with JSX syntax. So you can see as soon as we do that, we do now see the interface down in the preview area. Okay, one other quick change. This attribute of autocomplete, in React or JSX, we would actually want the C to be capitalized. So just as we saw with class name, you can see that attributes in JSX use camel case, meaning we capitalize any secondary words. Okay, at this point, now that we're outputting the HTML and our elements have the CSS class names, why don't we borrow the CSS from the finished product CodePen. So from that same link where we just borrowed the HTML, let's just borrow all of the CSS, copy that back in the CodePen we're working in, just paste it in the CSS column. Cool, so we at least have this now. It's starting to take shape. Now we do not see the randomly generated math problem above the input field here because that was being created with JavaScript. Now before we actually learn how to make something interesting happen in our React code, I do first want to show you how to stay organized in our React code. So earlier you might have noticed that I referred to our function of app, I referred to it as a component. So in React, the idea of a component is a super important concept. Essentially, we can break down our interface into separate little chunks or modules or components. This way we can reuse them in multiple places, or we can just have them separate for organization purposes. So for example, instead of having our entire interface just in this one overall app component, why don't we practice separating the progress bar area into its own separate component? Let me show you what I would do. Down towards the bottom of our code, so after our app function, but before we call React DOM.render, let's just make a brand new function. We can name it anything, but it does need to begin with a capital letter. In React and JSX, a component that you yourself are creating must start with a capital letter. So why don't we call it progress bar, parentheses, curly brackets, have it return a bit of JSX. Let's say parentheses so we can have multiple lines of code. Okay, now inside the parentheses, let's just cut and paste the HTML from up here. So I would just select this entire progress div down to here, just cut that or copy that into your clipboard. We no longer need it here. In its place where that code was, I'll just have an X placeholder. We'll circle back to this in just a moment, but then down in our progress bar function, in those parentheses, just paste in our clipboard. Okay, now that that function is returning that JSX, up in our overall template, instead of that placeholder X, we can just say progress bar. So we can essentially pretend that progress bar is an HTML element. Obviously it's not, it's a React component, but you get the idea. It's this simple to call it or include it or render it. Okay, so at this point we know some of the JSX basics and we know how to organize our code into separate React components. Now that we're familiar with this, I think it's time to actually bring our app to life or start worrying about the state of our game, right? So things like keeping track of how many points we've scored or keeping track of how many mistakes we've made, and also storing the currently randomly generated math problem in memory. Now in React, there's a very specific way that we work with our app data or the state of our app. Let me show you what I mean. So first of all, let's take the example of how many points we've scored up until this moment, right? How do we store our current score in memory? In our previous video, when we created the math game, since we were just using regular JavaScript without React, we could store that any way we wanted to. So in the previous video, we just had this object, we could have named it anything, and then we just gave it different properties. When you're just using plain JavaScript like this, it's the Wild West. You can do whatever you want. In React, there are rules and